Girl he met when they were at school together in England. They became sweethearts.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the 2022 Nanovic Forum lecture. My name is Clement Sedmak. I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Before we begin, please let me point out two practicalities. Please do not forget to switch your electronic devices back on after the event. We do not want you to miss an important call. And then we are video recording the lecture today. Lord Alton will be taking questions at the end. To ensure that your questions can be heard in the recording, we will ask you to please use the microphones in the Q&A session. This is our Nanovic Forum Lecture 2022. The Nanovic Forum is the annual signature event of the Nanovic Institute, and I'm so delighted to be able to welcome our speaker in person, finally. We had this event scheduled for the fall of 2020. The Nanovic Forum Lecture series is a particular gift of Robert and Elizabeth Nanovic. Sadly, Bob and Liz cannot be with us in person tonight, but they will receive the video recording, and we are sending our grateful greetings. Bob and Liz have created our institute with an inspiring vision, have generously provided for this lecture, and they have also supported the construction of Nanovic Hall. Thank you, Bob and Liz, as we like to say in the Nanovic Institute. Present with us this evening is Scott Appleby, Marilyn Keogh, Dean of the Keogh School of Global Affairs, and his wonderful wife, Barb. Welcome. Welcome to you all. A special welcome to Lord Alton of Liverpool, our Nanovic Forum speaker. We are grateful that David Alton, the Professor Lord Alton of Liverpool, is with us tonight. His journey was not as smooth as we would have wished it to be. He arrived only yesterday, and we just assume that jet lag has no power over legislating lords from lovely London lecturing in learned lounges.
I wish.
David Alton has served in both houses of the UK Parliament. He was a member of the House of Commons for 18 years, until 1997, when he was appointed a life peer. As many of you know, I'm from Austria, a former monarchy, and we are particularly fond of lords, dukes, counts, earls, and barons. This is not a criticism of the United States with its barren landscape of aristocratic traditions, but it's indeed wonderful to have a member of the House of Lords here with us tonight. David Alton began his career as a teacher, working in socially disadvantaged neighborhoods, teaching immigrant children and later children with special needs. In 1972, he was elected to the Liverpool City Council as Britain's youngest city councillor. He now serves on the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Select Committees. David Alton, a devout Catholic, is known for his human rights work. In his student union, he successfully proposed a campaign against apartheid and became active in community politics, choosing to live in a neighborhood where half the homes had no inside sanitation and had been designated as a slum clearance area. In 1987, he co-founded the children's charity Jubilee Action, and he serves as chair, patron, or trustee of a number of voluntary organizations. In 1997, he was appointed Professor of Citizenship at Liverpool John Moores University. In 2017, he was appointed as a visiting professor at Liverpool Hope University. He's a Knight Commander of Merit of the Order of St. George and a Knight Commander of the Order of St. Gregory the Great, both Roman Catholic orders of chivalry. In 2016, he was given the St. Thomas More Religious Freedom Award for his commitment to Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 2019, he was given a US State Department Award for his Article 18 work on freedom of religion or belief. Lord Alton is the author of several books, including Citizen Virtues, Euthanasia, Abortion, Building Bridges. He has also authored several reports on human rights in countries such as North Korea, Burma, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Brazil, Sudan, Tibet, and Rwanda, all of which he has visited. His latest book on genocide and its prevention, co-authored with Evelina Ojab, will be published soon. Genocide and its prevention are also the topic of Lord Alton's Nanovic Forum lecture. In his lecture, Lord Alton will discuss the repeated failure to avert genocide. He will describe a genocide amendment which he pioneered through the UK Parliament in 2021 and outline the way in which authoritarian regimes have undermined the United Nations Genocide Convention. The Nanovic Forum is a signature event of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. The mission of our institute is to build bridges between Europe and the United States. Tragically, also the concept of genocide builds a bridge between Europe and the United States. As you probably know, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish jurist, coined the term genocide. As early as 1933, he was working to introduce legal safeguards for ethnic, religious, and social groups at international forums. When the German army invaded Poland, he escaped from Europe, eventually reaching safety in the United States, where he took up a teaching position at Duke, and then moved to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1942 to join the War Department as an analyst. He later served with the team of Americans working to prepare the Nuremberg trials. His work served as a bridge to build a new global ethics based on human dignity and human rights. The Nanovic Institute is part of the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Keough School's mission is encapsulated in the term integral human development. Integral human development is an approach to social and political realities that puts the dignity of each human person at the center. Lord Alton's reflections tonight will shed light on the fragility of the recognition of human dignity and on what it takes to protect the dignity of each person. Lord Alton will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, 44 to 46 minutes, 43 to 52 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A. Lord Alton, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much.
Clemens, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I hope that when they come to write my obituary that it's as generous and as kind as those remarks. And thank you for setting the scene so well, not least in your reference to Raphael Lemkin, whom I'll talk about in the course of my remarks. But first of all, I'd like to say what a pleasure it is for me to be back again at Notre Dame. It's been a long time since I was here on the campus, though of course you have a campus in London, and as recently as last month I met some of your students when they were in London. It's always a pleasure to meet them, not least because this is a university of global renown, and having sat through this morning one of the classes that was being taught by Carter Sneed, I was incredibly impressed, not just by the teaching but also by the curiosity and the intelligence of the students who were there. They're a great credit to you. But I'm also, of course, very grateful to Clement Sedmak, the director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, to Monica Caro as well, who's been incredibly kind and helpful to me in overcoming some of the obstacle race in travelling in these COVID days, but everyone at Notre Dame who's made such an effort to ensure that this lecture actually goes ahead. And as you heard, it's been postponed twice because of COVID over the last 2 years. One of the reasons why I was keen to make sure it did happen is that from a distance I've greatly admired the work of the Nanovic Institute, and especially its focus on the transatlantic cousins who live on our side of the water in Europe. And I'm very honoured to be able to share my experiences, as you've asked me to do, as a European and British policymaker, and to share a European perspective on what is often called the crime above all crimes, genocide. And as Clemens just told you, it's quite topical for me as well, in that there's a new book which I've co-authored with my friend Dr. Ewelina Ohab, who originates from Poland and works in academia in the United Kingdom, and it will shortly be published. It's called State Responses to Crimes of Genocide: What Went Wrong and How to Change It. My lecture begins this evening, as the book does, by examining the genocide of the European Jews, the Holocaust, and the work of that Polish Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, over 40 of whose relatives were killed in the Holocaust. And it was Lemkin who coined the very word genocide, which I'll come back to. During my remarks, I'll also address the repeated failure to avert genocide in places like Europe's Balkans and now in China's Xinjiang. I've visited Western China and Tibet, and I'll say a lot about the position of the Uyghurs later in my remarks. And I'll also take you to some of the other places that I visited, from Darfur to Burma, North Korea, northern Iraq, and Ethiopia, where I've taken first-hand evidence or seen the appalling consequences of our failure to prevent genocide from recurring again and again. During the lecture, I'll also refer, as you've heard, to the Genocide Amendment, which I pioneered through the United Kingdom Parliament in 2021, to further bipartisan and bicameral legislation, which I have currently laid before the British Parliament and as recently as last week spoke to. And if anyone is not entirely put off by the end of my remarks this evening, then you can find the debates from last week's parliamentary discussions on my website. During the lecture, I'll outline the way in which authoritarian regimes, including Russia and China, have undermined the Genocide Convention, the upholding of the rule of law, the international community's ability to bring to justice the perpetrators of atrocity crimes, why never again happens all over again, and why those responsible for this most heinous of crimes are literally getting away with genocide. Now, although it took Raphael Lemkin to invent the word, historians would generally agree that the destruction of Melos in 416 BC by the Athenian army is perhaps the first documented example of what might today be described as genocide. But I'm going to move the clock forward and take my starting place in the 20th century. I'll not be able to refer to every event that's either accurately or inaccurately been described as genocide, but I do hope that by the time that I've completed my remarks, I'll have convinced you that genocides in the legal and the technical sense remain frequent occurrences and that our response and our mechanisms that inform our response are wholly inadequate. The first genocide of the 20th century is widely believed to have happened during the 4 years between 1904 and 1908, where many thousands of Herero and Namakwa people were killed in the German colony of southwest Africa, what we know today as Namibia. Some commentators see that genocide as a precursor of the Holocaust. A German general gave the order to, his words, annihilate the indigenous people, or, should that prove impossible, to expel them from the lands. The massacres which followed ended the lives of women, children, and unarmed civilians, an estimated 70,000 Herero and 7,000 Namakwa. Those who weren't killed were sent to concentration camps. A further precursor of the genocide of European Jews occurred 7 years later in Turkey's Ottoman Empire. Now, 2015 marked the 100th anniversary of the killings of more than 1 million Armenians, accompanied by the slaughter of Assyrians and Greek Christians. And to this very day, Turkey adamantly refuses to recognize those events as a genocide, although I might say, and I say this in praise, the United States House of Representatives has. I'll return to the repercussions of the Armenian genocide in influencing the thinking of Raphael Lemkin, but in parenthesis, and given the current situation on the borders of Eastern Europe, let me mention that between 1932 and 1933, it's estimated that as many as 10 million Ukrainians were killed in a man-made, deliberately targeted mass starvation, deliberately engineered by the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. It's been on my mind, obviously, a lot in recent days. I went to Ukraine in 1989. In fact, I was arrested going into the country with 2 companions. And I met there, for instance, a Bishop, Pavlo Vasilik, who'd spent 17 years in prison. I met the chairman of the Committee for the Defense of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, Ivan Gel, who'd been 18 years in prison, a young priest who was technically a stoker of boilers because he couldn't be a priest, and who'd been sent to Chernobyl to clear radioactive waste as a punishment for being caught celebrating the liturgies in the open. I visited churches that had been closed 40 years before, and every day the people in Ukraine had laid flowers in front of the doors of the churches that they were banned from going into. Every day the authorities would remove the flowers, and the next day the people would return with more. And for me, seeing a mass demonstration while I was there in 1989 of 50,000 people protesting for democracy and the rule of law and the end of Stalinism, what I see happening today with the massing of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine fills me with considerable dread. And the feelings of the people of Ukraine and their feelings towards Russia are still deeply influenced to this day by what happened to Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933 in that deliberate mass starvation of people. That's why they're so fearful of Russian occupation. But to return to my remarks about the Armenians, 13 years before the mass starvation of the Ukrainians, it was the mass atrocities and mass displacement of Armenians and Assyrians which stirred the consciences of many, including the conscience of Raphael Lemkin. He made a particular study of what happened in a place called Simele, which I'll mention again a little later on, in northern Iraq. I visited it in 2019. I literally saw protruding bones in what is now a rubbish dump, which is where the Assyrians have been massacred back in 1933. Lemkin studied it, not realizing that within a decade he would see the slaughter of his own family in mass atrocities. As in the case of so many genocides, those events against the Armenians and the Assyrians didn't come out of nowhere. Indeed, in 1896, a hero of mine who was British Prime Minister 4 times, William Ewart Gladstone, he was born in the great city of Liverpool, the city I was proud to represent in the House of Commons. But in 1896, Mr. Gladstone came out of retirement, aged 87, and returned for one last public rally in the city of Liverpool. And he did so, he explained to the crowd, he said, "You may wonder what brings an elderly man like me here to speak to you tonight." And there were thousands who'd gathered, the whole city had turned out. And he said, it was two Armenian gentlemen who'd come to see him at his home in North Wales and told him about what they had experienced and seen. And this is what he said. He demanded no ambiguity, no neutrality, but a condemnation of the crimes against humanity which were then occurring against the Armenians before the genocide which would come. He said, "The crimes against humanity have already come to such a magnitude and such a depth of atrocity that they constitute the most terrible, most monstrous series of proceedings that have ever been recorded in the dismal and deplorable history of human crime." 1896. Gladstone was right to prophesy that indifference would lead to catastrophic consequences for the Armenians. He told his audience that if they were indifferent when people in faraway provinces were slaughtered, it would only be a matter of time before the same horrors were visited upon them. There's an echo of that remark in a remark of Winston Churchill 40 years later, when people were turning a blind eye to what was happening in Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain said was a faraway country about which we know very little. Churchill famously said, "If you go on feeding the crocodiles, don't be surprised when the crocodiles come to feed on you." Between 1915 and 1919, the land was dyed red with Armenian blood. And those who survived were subject to mass deportations, and they form the basis of today's worldwide diaspora. And those events happened because people turned a blind eye. In 1965, Leonid Brezhnev gave permission for a genocide memorial to be erected in Yerevan, the capital of what was then the Soviet Union's Republic of Armenia. The towering obelisk, 40 meters high, is said to symbolize both the genocide but also the renaissance of the Armenian people. During a visit there in September 21, Pope John Paul II planted a tree at a memorial and composed a blessing for Armenia, which begins with these words: "Remember, O Lord, how the sons and daughters of this land have suffered." The museum adjacent to the memorial, which I visited with my daughter, has collated the memories, photographs and records into a damning indictment of both the objectives of the Ottoman Turks and the abject failure of the international community to act on the information which its own diplomats had assembled and which they had seen coming from 1896 onwards. Among the letters that my daughter and I read were some from 3 women who had been deported to Brazil. One had been pregnant and had miscarried her baby as they escaped. In a letter she wrote, these eyes saw things but the world should never see. The historian Arnold Toynbee wrote of this premeditated and systematic genocide these words: "The attempt to exterminate the Armenians during World War I was carried out under the cloak of legality by cold-blooded government action. These are not mass murders committed spontaneously by mobs and private people." Winston Churchill wrote that there is no reasonable doubt that this crime was planned and executed for political reasons. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II asserted in terms that, his words, "the best way to finish the Armenian question is to finish the Armenians." And 1.3 million lost their lives. Now, in 2019, as I told you, I visited northern Iraq, and I met some of the tiny remnant who remain in the region. I also saw evidence of the continuing, what I call slow burn genocide by ISIS, aided and abetted to this day by Turkey. And that brings within their sights Shia Muslims as a minority, Yazidis, Christians, and other minorities. President Erdogan not only glorifies the tragedies of those earlier days of the Armenian genocide, but eradicates all mention of those events from children's history books and targets any politician or country which dares to describe what happened to the Armenians as a genocide. When such a death warrant can be issued against a whole race, as happened with the Armenians, when outrageous brutality, mutilation and violence are left to haunt a country's landscape, when despots can plan the ethnic cleansing and annihilation of an entire people, it should be the subject of careful study, not least in our schools and in great universities like this. If you don't want history to repeat itself, you must at least be told truthfully about historical events. It was the great Englishman Ben Jonson who said, "Stand for truth, it's enough." But you need to know the role of your country in those events. The belief that no one really cares is what always encourages the tyrant. The Armenian genocide certainly convinced Adolf Hitler that he too could get away with genocide. Hitler believed he could destroy Europe's Jews and do so with impunity. His final solution of the Jews was preceded by his notorious question. These are his words: "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? The same rationale, a culture of impunity, led to the industrialized murders of the concentration camps, the collective amnesia about what had gone before, and it led to Hitler's ideology of a purified master race, directly inspired by the biological vision of a purified pan-Turkism based on racial origins and racial superiority. Even Hitler's corruption of medicine and science drew inspiration from the deliberate infecting of Armenians with typhus in a sequence of medical experiments. Even today, in 2022, despite the overwhelming evidence, just 32 countries currently recognize the crimes to which the Armenian people were subjected to as a genocide. This failure to recognize past genocides and to name them for what they are is not insignificant. Such denialism and associated impunity for the crimes committed inevitably results in further atrocities. But Turkey should note that despite its threats to countries which recognize the Armenian genocide, the issue never goes away and will not do so until Turkey itself honestly recognizes this chapter in its history as the infamy for what it was. When in 2019, the US House of Representatives decided that truth mattered more than pandering to Erdogan, Anna Issue, a Democrat congresswoman from California, the only Armenian-Assyrian member of Congress, said this: "I've been waiting for this moment since I first came to Congress 27 years ago. Members of my own family were among those murdered, and my parents fled with my grandparents to America. What all of the persecuted had in common was that they were Christians." In 1933, Franz Werfel, a Jewish writer who was helped by Catholics to escape from the Nazis, and who, I was thinking about this earlier when I was taken to the Lourdes grotto to light a candle, he also wrote the Song of Bernadette. He published a novel in 1933 called The 40 Days on Musa Dag. It's set during the Armenian Genocide. Werfel tells the story of several thousand Christians who took refuge on the mountain of Musa Dag, Moses' mountain. The fictional intervention of the French Navy led to their dramatic rescue. Those books, novels, were burnt by Hitler's Nazis, no doubt to give effect to his determination that Armenians wouldn't be remembered. Note too that despite numerous attempts by Armenians to have Werfel's novel turned into a Hollywood movie, Turkish pressure has prevented it to this day from reaching a mass audience. It gives credence to the old Armenian saying, echoed in Musa Dag, that to be an Armenian is an impossibility. But not only should we recall and give new definitions to those terrible events, giving the lie to Hitler's question, who now remembers the Armenians, insisting that we will never forget, but also because that deadly phenomenon of deportations, concentration camps, rape and killings did not end in 1915 with the Ottomans. And incidentally, as for the Ottomans' dream of ridding the Middle East of Christian minorities, the facts on the ground throughout the region bear out the scale of what has been allowed to occur, often without protest by any of their co-religionists. In 1914, Christians made up a quarter of the Middle East population. Today, they're less than 5%. Syria's Christian population has declined from 1.7 million in 2011 to below 450,000. In Iraq, ethnic cleansing and genocide has reduced the ancient Christian population there from 1.5 million in 2003 to below 120,000 today. Archbishop Basha Vorda of Erbil, whom I've hosted at a hearing in the Houses of Parliament, he told me this: the world should understand that on our path to extinction, we will not go quietly any longer, so that if someday we're gone, no one will be able to ask, how did this happen? So let's plead that we didn't know, that we had no idea. This slow burn genocide, which continues to this day, began with the Armenians and hasn't ended yet. In 1942, Stefan Zweig, whose books were also burnt by the Nazis, another Jewish writer, published his The World of Yesterday, Memoirs of a European. In it, he describes how quickly a relatively civilized and humane society and a seemingly permanent golden age can be ruthlessly and swiftly destroyed. His masterful autobiography charts the rise of visceral hatred, how scapegoating and xenophobia, cultivated by populist leaders, can rapidly morph into genocide and culminate in the hecatombs of the extermination camps. A fatal chain of events, then, with what I'm trying to describe, stretches from the Turkish genocide of the Armenians to Hitler's concentration camps, but also to the depredations of Stalin's gulags, Mao's Cultural Revolution, from the pestilential nature of persecution, demonizing, scapegoating, otherizing, and hateful prejudice, to the recent genocides against Christians and other minorities in Iraq and Syria, and to the razed villages of Rohingyas in Burma, to the horrific atrocities in northern Nigeria, and to the concentration camps in Xinjiang. When innocent human beings are murdered because of their identity, whether religion, ethnicity, or other sexual orientation, whatever it is, it's inexpressibly tragic and hauntingly cruel. It is a moral outrage that whole swathes of humanity are murdered, terrorized, victimized, intimidated, deprived of their belongings, and driven from their homes simply because of the way they worship, or because of their faith, or because of the way they live their life. When a regime tries to control what you believe or who you are, it will generally seek to try and control every other aspect of your life. Where Christians are persecuted, other human rights are often brutally abused. But as the story of the Armenians demonstrates, the failure to hear and respond to the alert of danger sounded by the canary in the mine has lethal consequences. It's hard not to conjecture that if in 1896 or 1915 the world had saved the Armenians, or after World War I had held those responsible to account, Hitler might not have so cavalierly believed he could strike against the Jews with such impunity. But, as Clemens suggested before the lecture started, the story didn't end there. After World War II, a valiant effort was indeed made to end the cycles of repetitive atrocities. At the time of the Armenian genocide, that young Jewish boy of Polish origin was reading Quo Vadis and was reading about Nero's throwing Christians to the lions. Raphael Lemkin said that his awareness of mass atrocities had first been stirred by that account. 20 years later, in 1933, he'd been working on defining other international crimes, such as the crime of barbarity. That was prior to his work on genocide and before the most egregious crimes of the Holocaust. And as I've said, more than actually 49 of his relatives were murdered. He'd studied the genocide of Assyrian Christians, particularly what had happened in Simele. He began working on definitions of a new crime targeted through hatred of a racial, religious, or social group, quotes, with the goal of its extermination. The horrific actions of the Nazis and in the 1930s and 40s had added a shocking new dimension to Lemkin's understanding of mass atrocities, but also, of course, to the urgency of the issue. Lemkin said that he began to seek a word to capture the severity of the Nazi atrocities after hearing Winston Churchill's radio broadcast in which Churchill stated that the Nazis had committed, quotes, a crime without a name, a crime without a name. This is what Lemkin wrote. New conceptions require new terms. By genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. This new word, coined by the author to denote an old practice in its modern development, is made from the ancient Greek word, genos, race or tribe, and the Latin, cide, killing, thus corresponding in its formation to such words as tyrannicide, homicide, infanticide, etc. Genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of a nation. And he proposed a definition as it's intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions, aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives, he said, of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide, he said, is directed against the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed against individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of the national groups. But, definitions, they're one thing. Acceptance and codification of those definitions is another. And in 1948, when Lemkin was working on the drafting of the United Nations Convention on the punishment of the crime, prevention and the punishment of the crime of genocide, shorthand the Genocide Convention, it was seen as a way to ensure that the world wouldn't ever again witness the kind of atrocities committed by the Nazis. However, when the immense scale of the loss of life seen during World War II has arguably not been matched since, acts of genocide and atrocity crimes have continued to be perpetrated. Since that war, and since the promulgation in 1948 of the Genocide Convention, we've witnessed genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, northern Iraq, and now in China, Burma, Nigeria, and potentially Tigray. And that's not an exhaustive list. The response, though, has always been inadequate, sadly demonstrating that Lemkin's noble ideals are insufficient on their own and why we need to revisit and revamp that convention. In reality, the promise to break the relentless and devastating cycles have not been kept. And I would argue that in recent years, things have actually got worse. Recall that in 2014, Daesh, ISIS, unleashed genocide against the religious minorities in Syria and Iraq. Then in 2017, in quick succession, the Burmese military launched a genocidal campaign against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, Burma, and harrowing reports emerged of ever-growing atrocities against Christian minorities in northern Nigeria. In 2018, we were shocked once more, this time by reports from China of a genocidal campaign against Uyghur Muslims. The end of 2020 brought us news of atrocities in Tigray, which continue to this day. A whole ethnic population is literally being starved to death through a blockade of food and medicines reaching the people of Tigray. But the word genocide, of course, should never be used lightly or inappropriately or purely for rhetorical purposes. In each case of mass atrocities, or within the last few years, the high legal bar has indeed been met. Yet in each instance, the world's response, just as happened in the past, has been utterly inadequate, making little difference to any of those targeted communities. You could say, taken at face value, this therefore doesn't offer very much hope for the future. But we shouldn't just be pessimists, and we can't simply accept that there's nothing which can be done to prevent mass atrocities, to recalibrate our response so as to try and deter future genocides, and at the very minimum, where they do occur, to respond differently and a darn sight more effectively. Against the backdrop of these frequent and recurring mass atrocities, these questions manifestly warrant urgent consideration by policymakers, especially when considered alongside the growing impunity of the perpetrators. Our failure to act inevitably results in further mass atrocities. There is no question about it. While genocide isn't to use to be words lightly, we shouldn't also let it become a word that doesn't dare speak its name. Although the word genocide shouldn't be used inaccurately, we shouldn't hesitate to use it whenever and wherever all elements of the crime are present. And moreover, where the elements of the crime of genocide are not all established, that shouldn't conclude the conversation. There are other categories of atrocity crimes, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes, which are inevitably harbingers, again, those canaries in the mine, often warning us of even worse to come. The need to return to the questions raised by Lemkin is underlined by the lamentable failure of the international community to do the things that are required, which are a duty on every signatory to that convention, as the United Kingdom is. And those duties are to predict, to prevent, to punish, and to protect the victims of genocide. It's been made urgent by the increasing role of authoritarian states around the world in subverting and controlling international institutions, not least the UN Security Council, the United Nations Council on Human Rights, and also the International Criminal Court, referrals to which require the agreement of the Security Council and which can be vetoed and are vetoed by countries like China and Russia. And it's become necessary because craven and sometimes duplicitous governments that place a higher premium on their business, on their trade and their diplomatic links with genocidal states rather than their duties under the 1948 Convention. The position of many governments, and certainly the United Kingdom government, has been to insist that declarations of genocide are not made by politicians, but by the international judicial system. Yet there's been no referral of any evidence by the UK government to any international judicial system. And while this passing of the buck, this macabre game of pass the parcel, continues, people are being ruthlessly targeted along with their identity, their culture and their history. So we need to ask searching and pertinent questions about our alliances, about our trading partners, about our values and how we respond. So it was why, during the passage of the Trade Act in the United Kingdom in 2021, I moved parliamentary amendments supported from across the political divide and supported in both houses of Parliament to limit trade with states credibly accused of genocide. And as recently as last week, I was involved in an amendment to prevent public bodies such as the National Health Service buying goods made by slave labour in genocidal states. I was struck that amongst the first supporters of my amendment was the British Board of Jewish Deputies. They know their history. They remember the Reichs-willing business partners, companies like IBM and Philips, which were complicit while Jews saw their businesses sequestrated and were forced into concentration camps. IBM was only one of many. And think today of today's trading relationships with the People's Republic of China, accused by both President Trump and President Biden, and by the US Congress and by the UK House of Commons, of genocide against the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang. Think of the big corporations and their sponsorship deals taking place at this very moment in Beijing at the Genocide Olympics. Companies like Coca-Cola with its major production plant in Xinjiang. Think of the cotton produced by Uyghur slave labour and the cheap goods that flood our markets, the products of slave labour. And it's obvious that what happened in the 1930s and 40s is happening all over again. The disturbing backdrop of the shocking treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, the use of slave labour, the mass incarceration of a minority, reports of forced organ harvesting, an issue that I raised again in Parliament last week. That's something that particularly Falun Gong practitioners have been subjected to, but others as well. The penetration of our national security infrastructures, the obscuration of the origins of COVID-19, the dismantling of democracy and the rule of law in Hong Kong, and the never-ending threats to the peaceful people of Taiwan, the atrocities in Tibet, and the subversion of international institutions, they're all of a piece. For saying so, I've personally been sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. The silencing of opposition is always the fallback position of every tyrant. But we shouldn't allow it to induce Trappist vows. It shouldn't silence us. We need to be outspoken, not less. We also need to be clear-headed about the subversion of international institutions. In a contemptuous display of arrogance, the Chinese government has imposed itself as an improbable member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, given that show trials, torture of prisoners and executions are among its hallmarks, along with its appalling treatment of the Uyghurs, Christians, Tibetan Buddhists and Falun Gong. The CCP will prevent the Human Rights Council from ever taking any action against it. The watchdog and the burglar have assumed the same identity. And many other governments, you think of the government of Germany with its massive trading relationship with China and its gas dependency on the Kremlin, they have also become lamentably silent. But others have spoken out. In December, the Independent Uyghur Tribunal was chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, and he's the man who prosecuted Milosevic for his genocidal crimes in Bosnia. That Uyghur Tribunal painstakingly collected evidence and interviewed witnesses throughout 2021. I attended some of its hearings, and I attended the delivery of its verdict in December, when it said that the crimes taking place in Xinjiang are a genocide. Paradoxically, the Chinese Communist Party has achieved the rare feat of uniting the House of Commons, the US Congress, the sometimes disparate G7 nations, as well as the Dutch Parliament, the Australian government, and the Canadian House of Commons in bringing them to an understanding that the CCP's ambition is to create a world safe for authoritarianism, and that genocide or crimes against humanity will not be an obstacle in its path. And academics and lawyers, incidentally, have reached the same conclusion. Only yesterday, travelling here, reading in the Times newspaper about a group of academics in the People's Republic of China who have been sent to mental institutions because they dared to question some of the internal policies of the Chinese Communist Party. This is very reminiscent of the sort of things that certainly happened in Soviet times, in the former Soviet Union. An expert report has been published by over 50 international lawyers who say that Xinjiang is a genocide, and every one of the criteria in the genocide, according to them, has been met. Meanwhile, the BBC has faced a ban in China because it dared to broadcast the testimonies of courageous Uyghur women who describe conditions in the concentration camps, including their forced indoctrination, rape, and public humiliation to the camp guards. What is happening in Xinjiang is ruthless and is barbaric. It's part of the CCP's long history of cruelty, drawn from the same playbook as the Cultural Revolution and the destruction of Tibetan ideology, religion and culture. Dominic Raab, then the British Foreign Secretary, told the United Nations Human Rights Council that what is afoot in Xinjiang, his words, is on an industrial scale and beyond the pale, given that some of his own family were victims of the Holocaust in Germany. This was a man who spoke from personal knowledge of such things, which he said he never believed that would ever be repeated in Europe, in the world. But while we argue about what name to give these events, is it to be business as usual? As you read reports of what's happening in Xinjiang, what word should come to your mind when you hear evidence of a state complicit in the destruction of the people's identity, complicit in mass surveillance, complicit in forced labour and in forced slavery, complicit in the uprooting of people, the destruction of communities and families, the prevention of births, the ruination of cemeteries where generations of loved ones have been buried. What word comes to mind when you hear of people being re-educated to believe that you, your people, your religion, your culture never existed, and the certainty that through ethno-religious cleansing, you will cease to exist? What word comes to mind when a foreign secretary says those words, that there is an industrial scale of atrocities taking place in forced labour and concentration camps? What word comes to mind on reading reports that 13 tons of human hair has been taken from the shaved heads of Uyghur people, exported to be used in wigs by those who are equally comfortable wearing fashion items made by Uyghur slave labour? How many heads would have to be shaved to produce 13 tons of hair? Do the math. An analysis of satellite imagery of the Chinese Communist Party's concentration camps has identified what looks like a crematorium, with estimates that there could be at least 9 others. The CCP says that the camps are educational and training facilities, but precisely what purpose does a crematorium have in an education facilities? Speaking to the BBC, one woman described how, I quote, "Some prisoners were hung on the wall and beaten with electrified truncheons. There were prisoners who were made to sit on a chair of nails. I saw people return covered in blood. Some came back without fingernails." She described one elderly woman, and I've met some of these witnesses, whose skin had been flayed. What word best describes those kind of depredations? I've seen reports that some prisoners have been used for medical experiments, with one witness saying, I quote, "Some of the men became sterile. Women are routinely raped." In response to questions at a 2021 hearing of the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Select Committee, on which I serve, key witnesses, including a former Chancellor of the Exchequer, the UK's former National Security Advisor, and the former head of the Foreign Office in China, declined to say whether trade should continue with a state accused of genocide. One said, "Oh, well, there's not really enough evidence." Another said that the question was too political. One rejected the suggestion that Britain should distance itself from China owing to its high human rights record, saying this, "I see no British prosperity without a trading relationship with China." And finally, one said, "There are many countries in the world with appalling human rights records with which we've had an economic relationship over many decades, and that's been a traditional position of the United Kingdom. But should it be? Our own new Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, has said what is happening in Xinjiang is a genocide. Is it licit, therefore, to continue business as usual? Tellingly, the United Kingdom's integrated review, Global Britain in a Competitive Age, which was published in March of last year, and which sets out the UK's future security, defence, development and foreign policy, along with its vision of the UK's role in the world over the next 2 decades, is also silent on the question of genocide and atrocity crimes. Trade is simply singled out in the review as standing at the heart of global Britain. But when asked whether we should trade with states accused of genocide, global Britain shrinks back into being a nation of little shopkeepers, willing, while we hold our noses, to do business as usual, whoever greases our palm. Yet genocide is not one of those, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that questions. No balance needs to be struck. This isn't just any old human rights violation. This either is the crime above all crimes or it's not. Global Britain, and indeed the United States and all countries, require a stable business environment for their potential trading partners. A genocide state isn't that. British businesses can't be expected to engage with countries disrupted by conflict and threatening insecurity. If a country is abusing human rights law, it's quite likely that it's also ignoring other international rules-based norms such as property law, contract law, and intellectual property law. In other words, countries such as China, Burma, Sudan, and Nigeria are dubious places to do business because they have poor human rights records. But this goes even beyond that. This is genocide. The UK owes a duty of care to British business people and taxpayers not to pretend that trading in a state that carries out such crimes isn't without great risks. We should not accept the counter-argument that trade somehow brings liberal democracy. It hasn't in China, it hasn't in Saudi Arabia. It didn't when the West was heavily involved in Iran and Canada's decades of trade with communist Cuba moved the Castro brothers not one jot. This isn't a new debate. 200 years ago, the foremost champion of free trade, Richard Cobden, the great northern British radical, said that free trade was not more important than our duty to both oppose the trade in human beings, the slave trade, and also the trade in opium. He opposed both, and on the latter he forced a 4-day parliamentary debate, and with bipartisan support he defeated the government. In facing that same question in our own times, of knowing where and when a great nation must draw a line, I hope that the forthcoming book that I mentioned will make a modest contribution to the debate and help us to act in accordance with Raphael Lemkin's belief that genocide must be treated as the crime above all crimes and be combated in a more effective way. In answering the question, why have perpetrators been able to get away with genocide, there needs detailed analysis of multiple failures, focusing on the lack of comprehensive monitoring mechanisms, methodology to determine genocide, and our wholly inadequate too little, too late approach. The Genocide Convention itself requires us to predict, prevent, protect and punish, and we do none of them effectively, and governments have become what has been described as an alibi for inaction. By contrast, in 1948, Lemkin's desire for justice, lasting peaceful cooperation combined with the horror of war and the degradation of human life and human dignity provided the impetus for the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention. The political will was so strong that the actors of the day worked tirelessly and got the job done for the good of the many. It was the practice of law and politics at its best, and we can learn a great deal from that. Let me draw to a conclusion. Recall that at the beginning of 2014 in northern Iraq, we saw the commencement of a new wave of mass beheadings of so-called infidels. People, including gay people, including people from religious and ethnic minorities, were thrown from high buildings. Prisoners were burned in metal cages, women raped, and homes looted. These atrocities then intensified in their number and scope. On the 3rd of August 2014, Daesh attacked Xinjiang, killing thousands of Yazidis, abducting thousands of women and girls, and forcing the rest to flee. This attack on the Yazidis was followed by subsequent mass atrocities in the Nineveh plains, which I visited, where Christians were forced to flee or die. Daesh was responsible for murder, enslavement, deportation, the forcible transfer of populations, exploitation, abuse, abductions of women and children, and forced marriage and enforced disappearances. Lemkin expected the word genocide to be matched by the deeds of political leaders, but it never has been. We failed to predict that genocide, we failed to prevent it, we failed to protect the victims of genocide, and we failed to prosecute the perpetrators of genocide. On day 189 of the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War into the crimes of the Holocaust, the French prosecutor, Augustus Champetier de Ribes, said the Holocaust was a crime so monstrous, so undreamt of in its history, through the Christian era up to the birth of Hitlerism, that the term genocide had to be coined to define it. Implicit in what she said, in Lemkin's genocide endeavour, and Churchill's need to give such gross inhumanity a name, was a determination to be deadly serious in confronting these monstrous crimes. But as we saw in Iraq against the Yazidis, Christians and others, that didn't happen. The late Jonathan Sacks, Lord Sacks, the United Kingdom's former chief rabbi, describes in his book The Dignity of Difference the importance of recognizing that people have got to learn to live alongside one another and to find ways in which we can accommodate difference. In a debate not long before he died on anti-Semitism, he told Parliament this: "The hate that begins with Jews never ends with them. What begins with hate crimes can so quickly morph into genocide." When in 1948, the US, the UK and other major powers passed the convention and the UDHR, well, the UDHR came just one day after the promulgation of the Genocide Convention, and Lemkin wondered if part of the driver behind the timing was in a way to distract attention to the convention. Either way, after his death in 1959, no one did anything with the Genocide Convention, until the mid-1960s, and significantly, from 1953 until 1967, not a single US Senate voice was raised calling for the United States to even ratify the Genocide Convention. 14 years of silence. And not much was said in the UK or elsewhere either. But then a senator, Senator William Proxmire, came on the scene. He was an economically conservative Democrat who stood for election to the US Senate 3 times and lost 3 times. When attacked for being a loser, he said he'd be happy to represent all the losers. Not a bad aspiration if it paves the way for a successful conclusion. In 1957, after Proxmire was finally elected, a friend introduced him to Lemkin's legacy. As senator for Wisconsin, in 1967, Proxmire stood before the Senate and told them that lack of ratification was a national disgrace. From 1967 until 1986, he then spoke on the subject each and every single day on which the Senate was in session, until using almost every bill available to make the case for ratification. He was often caricatured as an irritating gadfly, but there's a lot to be said for the awkward squad in politics. Every speech was a new one, and more often than not, given to an almost empty floor. For 20 years, he returned to his theme a total of 3,211 times. On the 11th of February 1986, the Senate finally ratified Lemkin's Genocide Convention by a vote of 83 to 11. It was called the Proxmire Law. When wondering what we can do and how we should act, Proxmire's successors, perhaps some of them here at Notre Dame, need to return to the fray. Ask yourself how many policy fields would parliamentarians be content to pass critical legislation intended to unlock a freedom or to mitigate a risk at home or abroad that they then never seek to use or ensure is implemented. And in the long term, by using the tools available to us, it helps us in at least 2 ways. First, it's the right thing to do in the face of persecution. And secondly, it serves humanity's interests. I'll end with Judge Thomas Bergenthal, who as a young boy was incarcerated at Auschwitz, a victim of the genocide against Europe's Jews. He survived the Shoah, and he throws down this challenge to each of us who greet contemporary stories of genocide with incomprehension, incredulity, or a sense of, well, is there anything I can do about this? He said, the human mind is simply not able to grasp this terrible truth. A nation transformed into a killing machine, programmed to destroy millions of innocent human beings for no other reason than they were different. If we humans can so easily wash the blood of our fellow humans off our hands, then what hope is there for sparing future generations from a repeat of the genocides and mass killings of the past? One cannot hope to protect mankind from crimes such as those that were visited upon us unless one struggles to break the cycle of hatred and violence that invariably leads to ever more suffering by innocent human beings. In responding to Bergenthal's challenge to break these cycles of hatred and to Lemkin's hope for humanity, for the Genos, by creating the architecture to deal with the drivers of atrocity crimes and especially genocide, it will require a recalibrating of our policies, a recalibrating of our resources, and a much stronger, greater political will in concluding the unfinished business of 1948. So thank you, Clemens, to the Nanovic Institute and the European studies that you undertake here, and to Notre Dame for inviting me to give this lecture this evening. I hope that some of what I've said will perhaps touch some of you, and maybe you will find ways in order to make a reality of some of Lemkin's hopes. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, you were warned by the director that you were going to have the chance to ask questions, and no doubt, like anybody else in politics, I'll try and dodge each and every single one of them. But
Thank you very much, Lord Alton. We have about 15 to 18 minutes for Q&A. The floor is open for questions and comments. Your chance to talk to Lord Alton of Liverpool. We have one question over here. Yes, please.
Thank you, Lord Alton, for the wonderful presentation, if it's possible with genocide, it's always hard to ask or to speak after a speech, after genocide. But my name is Tamás Ádány. I'm a Fulbright Fellow here. I'm a lawyer at the law school. So my question relates to the discrepancies or shortcomings of the legal definition. In your experience, or according to your experience, does it give a better understanding of the public opinion of societies not directly connected to the genocide? So other countries, if you call it a genocide or if you call it crimes against humanity?
It's a good question, because do words matter? Does definition matter? And the answer is yes, and there has been research done here in the States at a couple of universities and also in the UK, which looks at what response you get depending on which words you use. But you have to use them accurately, because otherwise, as I said in my remarks, it can be done with a rhetorical flourish. It's a genocide when it isn't a genocide. And for goodness sake, crimes against humanity and war crimes are pretty shocking. What's happening in Tigray at the moment, I co-chair the all-party parliamentary group on Eritrea, and what is happening there as a result of the Ethiopian government blockading the sending not just of food but of medicines. Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, the doctors and nurses have no medical supplies whatsoever. This is a war crime. Now, the elimination of people simply because they're Tigrayans would be a genocide, but that is a much higher threshold and one which one has to demonstrate, and you can only do that by the collection of evidence. The problem often is that we only do it after the event. We think about it afterwards, and then we want to put a name to it, and we're still arguing about the Armenian genocide. So words matter, but when you use them matters even more. And the warning signs, the canaries in the mine, I think are crucially important. The Bosnia judgment is interesting because as a lawyer it's worth you looking at this, because it looked at what had happened in Bosnia, and determined it was a genocide, and said that the 1948 convention stood, but that what it wasn't sufficiently specific about was the duty placed on those who were signatories to it to act the instant, their words, it became clear that a genocide was underway. But if you don't collect the information, if you don't have someone on the ground, if you haven't got advanced warning mechanisms, then afterwards you say, oh, we didn't know. I visited Rwanda after the genocide there, and it was heartbreaking to visit some of the sites. The mass graves that had been created, I mean, a million people. Tutsis had been murdered by this inflammatory hatred that had been built up amongst the Hutus, who demonized this group of people, the envy, the jealousy, the hatred, then just concluded in this, beyond the fulminations, concluded in this orgy of violence and so many deaths. What was interesting was that everyone had seen this coming. And in fact, it was interesting for me that President Clinton said afterwards it was the greatest mistake of his presidency, I think were his words, the failure to recognise and do something about it. Certainly one of the UK government ministers, who was a minister at that time, Linda Chalker, has said exactly the same thing. One of our high representatives at the United Nations, who's now a member of the House of Lords, who's a colleague and friend, he says he regards it as his greatest failure because information had been given to him and they failed to act on it. But that also begs questions. You've got the information, what are you then going to do about it? And if you go back to Dag Hammarskjöld, who was probably, I think, the greatest of the UN General Secretaries, motivated by his Christian faith, and his little autobiography collection and anthology of some of his writing, Markings, I think it's called, is a lovely thing for perhaps students of diplomacy and of the dream that underpinned the making of the UN. It's well worth reading. Hammarskjöld said the UN wasn't created in order to create paradise, it was created to stop mankind from going to hell. And we don't even do that. You know, if we had the capacity, the military capacity, to be able to intervene, then we should intervene. But there are always vested interests. In Tigray, you'd say, what vested interest could be? Russia and China have interests in Ethiopia. And so they have been blocking any action by the United Nations Security Council in holding to account those responsible for what's happening in Tigray. And you would say, well, if you can't even do it in a country like Ethiopia, what chance are you going to have in China when we're talking about one of the countries that serves on the UN Security Council? And to get something, the United States is not, has not signed up to the Rome Statute and therefore to the creation of the International Criminal Court. The United Kingdom has. But even the UK is not, its permanent member of the Security Council, has not laid anything before the Security Council trying to refer the People's Republic of China to the ICC, because it says when you raise it with the British government, oh, it will be blocked by China using their veto. Or give you another example. The UN actually established a committee of inquiry to look at human rights violations in North Korea. It's a country I visited on 4 occasions. I've written a little book about it. Judge Michael Kirby, a great jurist in Australia, he carried out that inquiry. It was a UN inquiry. He found not genocide at the end of it, although he left a question mark about whether certain groups in the country, not least Christians, might be subjected to genocide, but he did find crimes against humanity. This was a UN Commission of Inquiry. It reported to the UN General Secretary, and it said this should be referred to the International Criminal Court. It has never been. 3 or 4 years later now, it's still never been. Why? Because of the power of veto. So that begs questions about the way in which countries that share common values, liberal democracies, and believing in the rule of law, what they do about that. And it may be that we have to construct not just new military alliances like AUKUS, the alliance that's been created with Australia in the face of China's threat in the Pacific. Maybe we need to be doing something similar in aligning law-abiding nations in saying it's just a sign of weakness at the present time that people with impunity countries can carry out these things and not be beholden to any system of justice. So I don't think we can leave it where it is. Yes, there is a difference between genocide and crimes against humanity, war crimes, human rights violations, and you work your way through them. They morph from one thing to another. I've written about Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and described it as an orphaned right. It's the right that says a person is free to believe, not to believe, or to change their belief. It's violated day by day all around the world. But as many scholars have noted, once that article starts to be violated, other things happen too. And once you start allowing persecution, you can see it in Pakistan, for instance. I'm not suggesting there's a genocide underway in Pakistan. There most certainly is terrible persecution. I visited Pakistan 2.5 years ago to plead for the case of Asia Bibi, and I'm glad to say she was freed. She was on death row for so-called blasphemy. The woman was illiterate. She couldn't have written a blasphemy, and eventually the Supreme Court in Pakistan acquitted her. She was allowed to leave. She's now living with her family in Canada. But as recently as 2 weeks ago, 2 Christian pastors were murdered in Pakistan. Terrible persecution takes place. This should be a warning sign to us of what more could follow unless action is taken. And there are people in Pakistan that want action to be taken, lawyers amongst them. So it's important that lawyers band together and act on everyone's account. The rule of law is central. I mean, if you're not going to send gunboats, if you're not going to declare war, then the only thing you can do is to insist on the upholding of law.
We may have time for fewer questions than I thought we would have time for.
Sorry,
no,
I will try to be briefer then, maybe, in that case.
Depends how many questions we have. Any other questions, footnotes, comments? Lead Everby, please. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for a terrific presentation. My question is about strategies of denial by regimes that have committed either crimes against humanity or genocide, or in the case of Erdogan, who are refusing to acknowledge, in this case, Turkish genocide in the past. The range of strategies of denial, and it didn't happen. It's something that we acknowledge, and it's part of there are justifications for it, et cetera. I listened to an interview with the the new Chinese ambassador to the United States recently, and he was pressed on the Uyghur situation. And he denied that it was anything like a genocide. He denied many of the things you cited. He did not deny that there's compulsory education and training, that this was not a voluntary program. I mean, the things he kind of acknowledged were themselves, if not crimes against humanity, certainly highly questionable. So the question is, strategies of denial, and whether it matters in a way, what the explanation, so to speak, might be.
Well, thank you very much, Dean. I think that, again, it's the pursuit of truth, and putting it out there, what we know to be happening, is crucially important, that people should hear evidence, which is why Sir Geoffrey Nice held this long-running tribunal over most of the last 6 months before it concluded. The People's Tribunal, the sort of thing that's been done before. Bertrand Russell, I think, set up probably the first of such tribunals going right back to the period of Vietnam. So there are precedents for doing this, but if you can't get anybody else to examine the evidence, then you can start to do it yourself. But you need a credible and celebrated figure to chair such proceedings, and it's got to be seen to be proper. And indeed, the Chinese were given the chance to present evidence. Needless to say, they refused to participate. How do you test these things? Well, one way of testing it, of course, is to ask for access to go and see for yourself and to be allowed to take in independent monitors. And of course, China has denied that throughout. Similarly, the way that they have closed down debate. Anyone who dares to put a dissenting opinion, not just on Uyghurs, but you take Xinjiang. She's the young Christian woman who was a people's lawyer, trained as a lawyer, but also as a citizen journalist. And she went to try and discover what information she could in Wuhan about the origins of COVID-19. She's now in prison for 4 years for daring to try and shine a light on what was happening. And she's not alone. There are other journalists and others who have done the same. If you think about Hong Kong, I presented personally a young man called Joshua Wong when he came to London with our Westminster Award for Human Rights, Human Life and Human Dignity. Joshua is one of the pro-democracy activists. He is now rotting in a Chinese jail in Hong Kong. My good friend Jimmy Lai, a devout Catholic who owned Apple Daily, was the mass circulation newspaper which told the truth, now closed down. Jimmy's in prison. I think of people like Margaret Ng, a wonderful barrister. Martin Lee, the father of democracy in Hong Kong. He was a member of the assembly there and one of the originators of the pro-democracy movement. Both of them devout Catholics, both of them now Martin's in his 80s, I think Margaret's in her 70s, both of them on suspended prison sentence because they lit candles at a vigil for democracy. So, I mean, some of this has to speak for itself. So our denialism is important here as well, that we start to deny things because we say, well, we haven't got proof positive. Well, I've met people, Nuri Takal, for instance, but also Rahima Mahmood, extraordinary Uyghur woman who has given personal testimony at Westminster. There's a Uyghur doctor who was involved, was forced into carrying out forced organ harvesting and who's given evidence at Westminster. I mean, extraordinary to hear these accounts. So this I think is important, that in our free societies, in democracies, we constantly try to shine a light on these places and give an opportunity for people to come and speak and then evaluate the evidence. What more can we do than that? And then think back to those brave people who, during the Nazi era, but also during the Soviet times as well, would not be silenced. They found ways of speaking out. Sometimes it cost them dearly. Maximilian Kolbe, after all, was told by the Nazis, you can carry on publishing your mass circulation newspaper Night so long as you make no social comment, just stick to liturgical niceties and pietism. He responded the following day with an editorial that said, no one in the world can change truth. And he said, beyond the hecatombs of the extermination camps, there are two irreconcilable enemies. And what use is it if a man is defeated in his innermost personal self? And for writing that editorial, of course, he was taken to Auschwitz, where he very courageously stepped forward and took the place of another prisoner and was executed. So it is possible, and Bonhoeffer is another example of that. So not everyone collaborates, not everyone conforms, and sometimes it costs them their own lives, which is a shocking thing to have to say, and, you know, sitting in the comfort as we are of a wonderful university. But if we don't take a stand, Bonhoeffer said, not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act.
Thank you. We cannot have a Nanovic event without a student question. So I will ask a follow-up question, and then Garrett, it will be your turn. Let me ask a very short follow-up question to that. Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide, the motivations behind it, is it more national honor, pride, or is it legal implications?
There is the issue of recompense, certainly for victims of genocide, and of course it was rather like many of those Jewish families who survived the Holocaust and found that their homes had been seized, their land, their possession. Even to this day, works of art will turn up from time to time which were looted and plundered by the Nazis, and there are still legal battles, as you know, about those things. So of course Turkey would be fearful about some of the legal implications, but it's also about this horrid authoritarian nationalism which he certainly represents. And this isn't just about the Yazidis and Christians, though, you know, having been to Simele and Nineveh and so on, I mean, it's very much, that is in my heart. But I also visited during that time a Kurdish refugee camp where people, it had only been opened 2 months earlier after people fled from a white phosphorus attack. This is not regarded as a chemical weapon, I discovered, for some extraordinary reason, because it's a tracer. So it's not regarded as a weapon. And yet I saw people who had been burnt by this, and there were terrible pictures of children who'd been burnt by this specific attack that drove these people from their homes. Who did that? That was Turkey. They are a member of NATO, and yet did so with complete impunity. Turkey also then supported Azerbaijan when it went in and began reignited the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, where drove the Armenians out in order to reconquer that enclave, which is a historic part of Armenia. So this isn't all over. And I mean, if you look at some of the material that is produced in Turkey or by Turkey, some of the stuff that I've seen that has gone out in Azerbaijan, caricaturing the Armenians, it is the same principle that the Ottomans used, but the best Armenians are dead ones.
Thank you. Maybe our last question will go to... Oh, wait a minute. 2 questions. Gary, we take two questions together. Gary,
We can.
Hi, Lord Alton. Thank
Hi.
you so much for being here today. I was talking with a friend recently. She unfortunately couldn't be here, but she is watching from afar. And we had a question that we were curious to hear your response to. So certainly the international response to a genocide is important, but what do you believe is the best method for restorative justice within the country itself to prevent genocide from ever happening again there?
thank you, Garrett. So restorative justice in the country itself is the question. It's the last one.
Yes. Hi, my name is Angelina. I'm a Master in Global Affairs student. Thank you for honoring us with your presentation. We have the ICJ procedures and on the trials against genocides take even 25 years after a genocide occurs, as we just saw with the Ugandan case that came a couple of days ago. So what are your reflections on the impunity that has covered a lot of years after a genocide happens, and that we could prevent of lagging that much time to have a justice?
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
So restorative justice in the country, that's the delay.
they're both worthy of 2 more lectures, I suspect, but let me try anyway.
5 minutes.
Oh, thank you, Director. So taking the first question about restorative justice, Rwanda's a good country to go to because they have a process called gacaca. And I went out with one of their government law officers, a lovely man. He took me to one of the prisons where I met some of those who've been responsible for some of the Rwandan genocide. So long as they were willing under the gacaca process to recognize what they had done and also to meet with victims of the genocide, then they can begin the process of restoration and of rehabilitation back into society. We could probably learn a lot from this. I can't see it being a system that we're about to introduce in the UK, but it was interesting for me as a European to see this literally happening in Rwanda. And what do you do when 1 million of your people have been murdered? How do you start? And reconciliation clearly is a huge part of that process. We've seen that in Northern Ireland. It was not a genocide, but coming as I do from a British-Irish background. My mother was Irish. My father was British and fought in the armed forces in the Second World War. He was a desert rat. And I've always had to recognise, you know, the bringing together of two sides of a story and know that terrible things were done by both sides. The day after I was elected to the House of Commons, the IRA blew up a member of the House of Commons the day after I was elected in the precincts of Parliament. And I've seen terrible atrocities, but I've also know the stories of some of the things that the British did and had to be instigated. You heard that my very first speech in my student union in Liverpool was about apartheid, and it was in connection with rugby and cricket tours and why we should not go and attend those matches. In fact, we should protest at those matches if they were going to be all white teams coming from South Africa. And that and the pressure many of us put on banks like Barclays Bank and said, who have been promoting South African interests, while you continue to do that, we will not support you. So there are a number of tools that you can use. The important thing is to do something, but I never underestimate the importance of restoration, of people having another chance in life and moving forward. And sometimes you just have to work on people to bring about change. And your question, which was a very good one too, on the use of law itself. Recently there was a case in Germany where someone who was responsible for some of the crimes I've just described against the Yazidis was brought to justice, and he was tried and found guilty of not crimes against humanity but genocide. That's the first time that anyone has been convicted of genocide for what happened against the Yazidis, and I cheered when that was done by a German court. Because now I've been able to go back to the British government and say, well, you said you won't do anything until a court of law decides these things. I mean, my own amendment would have created a path to the British High Court, by the way, for the British High Court to be able to determine if a genocide had occurred, and if so, what the implications were, therefore, for us as signatories to the 1948 Convention. But now that a domestic court in another European country has done this, that has allowed me, I've raised it in the House already, but it's allowed me to say to the British government, how many courts have got to do this for you to decide that you're going to take some kind of action? So there are ways of bypassing the problem of getting something before the ICC or the ICJ. The ICJ is quite interesting in that a small African country recently took Burma, the Burmese military, to the ICJ in The Hague. And you may remember that Aung San Suu Kyi actually went and defended the military. She's now, of course, their prisoner. I mean, there are so many extraordinary twists and turns in some of these stories. I mean, I've met her, she would say, of course, I have the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army. She said, I have to defend our country's army, who founded the Tatmadaw, her father. She said, I am my father's daughter. Yes, but you're also an iconic figure that many of us campaign for because of your belief in democracy and the rule of law. And you think, how could this happen? That someone in that position would defend the things that the Tatmadaw had done. But that did go to the ICJ, and we're still waiting to hear what their determination is. But certainly from the evidence that was laid before it, it was quite clear that a light had been shined on them. And some would argue that the military coup in Burma was partly precipitated by this public exposure of the Burmese military. It's not a justification for the coup by no means, but it may be an explanation for it. And what have we got to do? We've got to uphold the rule of law, and you've got to hold leaders to account. And the only way you can do that, as I've been arguing all evening, is to provide legal remedies and mechanisms to make that happen. And if the ones that we have at the moment don't work, we'll replace them with some that do.
Thank you. So this is the book cover of Lord Alton's book that will be published soon. You can grab one of those as an incentive to buy and read and digest outside. I was told we have a small gift for Lord Alton. If you don't want to carry it with you, we can ship it to you, because there is, this
Goodness.
picture with the hand luggage. Do you want to take a look? Do you
Can
want
I?
to take it out now?
Oh, well, I bet.
Everyone.
Presents, my goodness. Thank you. Let me see. Oh, wow. It's your dome.
Does it remember you? Yeah. So you will hang this on your office door, and whoever comes in will know you have been here and graced this campus with your presence.
Well, I shall have it as a wonderful
reminiscence of this evening as well, and being in your company.
Yes, we got it. Thank you.
The perfect director.
Dear friends, thank you so much for coming tonight. Special thanks to Garrett and Angelina for their questions. Of course, also to our Dean for his presence in this question. Lord Alton, thank you so much for your lecture and the Q&A. Enjoy the rest of your evening, the rest of your life, and thanks to all who made this possible, including my Nanovic team and the tech support. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. That's a lovely thing to give me. Thank you.
For you.